Hi everybody. Welcome to the fourth module on the course Early Childhood Care and Education. The fourth module is on the theoretical foundations and implications towards learning and development with special focus on the behaviorism and the social learning concepts. This module comes to you in the form of 3 videos. The first video would elaborate you on the concept of learning, and it would explain how classical conditioning helps towards learning. And the second video would elaborate you on the operant conditionings and how the reinforcement and punishment play an important role towards learning of a human being. The third video is how do children learn by means of imitation and practice in the way of social learning as proposed by Bandura. So, now let us move on to the concept of learning. What is meant by learning? Learning refers to changes in behavior as a result of experience. Babies are born with integrated learning mechanisms and capacities that allow them to gain from experiences. Any human being at a younger age learns through 2 basic forms of learning, namely classical and operant conditioning. And the next, they learn by observing and imitating others. Let us learn of all these approaches in detail. At the end of this video, you will be able to understand the concept of learning, describe the behaviorist approaches to learning, namely classical conditioning, and the third is to take up the responsibility of guiding children of 0 to 6 years to develop desirable behavior and extinguish the undesired behavior. Before getting into the theories of learning, the concept of learning should be well understood. Learning is defined as a process that results in a relatively consistent change in behavior or behavior potential based on experience. Why is it called relatively consistent change? After you have learned swimming and are confident in doing it, you will probably always be able to swim. However, you should realize those consistent changes may not be permanent changes. For example, if you give up swimming, the speed with which you swim might have declined from their original speed, but it is sure that it will be easier to learn a second time. And what is a change in behavior or behavior potential? Most of the learning is apparent from the improvement in performance. Example, driving a car. However, in many instances, performance may not show everything you have learned, as an improvement in performance cannot be measured. Example, appreciation of modern art. In such instances, you are said to have achieved a potential for behavior change. Now, why do we say it is based on experience? Remember, it is only through experience that a learning can take place. Experience includes taking in information, assessment, transformation, and manifestation of responses that affect the environment. Now, let us get into the classical conditioning concept. Babies are born into the world with a built-in set of learning mechanisms that profit them to experience immediately. Kids at very young age are capable of 2 basic forms, as already told to you. It is about the classical conditioning and the operant conditioning. The first approach is going to be explained to you in detail. Russian physiologist Ivan Pavlov discovered classical conditioning, for which he got the Nobel Prize in the year 1904. Learning by classical conditioning is by associating an environmental or neutral stimulus with a naturally occurring stimulus. Classical conditioning is defined as a form of learning that involves associating a neutral stimulus with a stimulus that leads to a reflexive response. Now on to the Pavlovs experiment. Reflex response constitute the crux of classical conditioning. A reflex is nothing but an automatic response to specific stimuli such as salivation, eye blinking, etc. The reflexes are biologically important for the survival of any organism. The accidental discovery of the innate salivation or reflex of dogs at the site of the foot paved way for Pavlov for the classical conditioning process. Now, look into the figure which shows the Pavlov's restraining harness. Pavlov's experiment was carried out by placing a dog in a restraining harness. A stimulus, sound of a bell, was presented at regular intervals, and then the dog was provided with some food. At first, the dog had no prior meaning for the tone concerning food or salivation. It was just an orienting response at first. The dog picked its ears, moved its head to trace the source of the sound. However, with the frequent pairings of the tone and the foot, the orienting response is no more manifested, whereas salivation begins. This phenomenon was found to be similar to another stimulus also. Pavlov demonstrated the generality of this effect by using a variety of other stimuli such as light, etc. Now in detail about the process of classical conditioning. On the whole, classical conditioning involves forming an association between a neutral stimulus and natural stimulus, resulting in a learned response. The three basic stages of classical conditioning are before conditioning, during conditioning, and after conditioning. In the first stage, that is the before conditioning stage of the learning process, Pavlov provided a natural stimulus, the sight of the foot, that will automatically elicit a response that is called salivation. In other words, the unconditioned stimulus, which we call it as UCS, produces an unconditioned response that we call it as UCR. At this point, a neutral stimulus that produces no effect is introduced. Here, the neutral stimulus is the sound of a bell. It is found that the neutral stimulus can evoke a response when paired with UCS several times. Therefore, unconditioned stimulus UCS refers to naturally occurring stimuli that evoke a response. Whereas the unconditioned response UCR is the automatic response that is manifested when subjected to the unconditioned stimulus. Now, the stage 2 is during conditioning. For this stage, Pavlov introduced a neutral stimulus, the sound of a bell, that is getting repeatedly paired with the UCS, the foot. Hence, an association between the neutral stimulus and the natural stimulus UCS is facilitated. If the association could trigger the salivation response, then the neutral stimulus is called the conditioned stimulus or CS. The once neutral stimulus, after being associated with the natural stimulus, eventually triggers a conditioned response, and this stimulus is called as the conditioned stimulus. Now the third stage is after conditioning. Once the association has been made between the UCS and the CS, Pavlov found that the CS, even when presented alone without UCS, will trigger a response. The resulting response of salivation, even without food, is known as the conditioned response or CR, which refers to the habituated or learned response to the once neutral stimulus. Hence, UCS, UCR connections are provided by nature, but the CS-CR connections are produced by learning through classical conditioning. Now, after understanding the concept of classical conditioning, what are its uses in the real world? Few of the real world applications for classical conditioning are now explained to you. First one is that classical conditioning mechanisms are used by many dog trainers to train their pets. Phobias or anxiety problems could also be treated by the principles of classical conditioning. And very important, you as a prospective teacher could apply classical conditioning in the classroom setting. For example, an anxious situation of performing on the stage can be paired with a pleasant reward by which the child could learn to stay relaxed and calm on the stage. Hope the theory on classical conditioning would have explained to you of how a child learns by means of associating a neutral stimulus and then learn that particular behavior. Also, you are provided with few of the implications that as a teacher you could use in the classroom environment. Hoping to meet you for the next concept on operant conditioning. Thank you.